All right, well, let's get started. So our next speaker is Robert M. Owens, professor of history at Wichita State University in Wichita, Kansas. He received his PhD in history from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, if I could talk, Urbana-Champaign. He is the author of Mr. Jefferson's Hammer, William Henry Harrison and the Origins of American Indian Political Policy, Red Dreams, White Nightmares, Pan-Indian Alliances in the Anglo-American Mind, 1763 to 1815. How long?
Too many hyphens in that title. It killed sales. Absolutely killed sales.
I mean, how long did it take you to think up that title?
I've never once suggested a title to the publisher and said, yeah, that's a good one. It's always like the fifth or sixth, kind of throwing my hands up. So yeah, that's
quite the title. And he has a forthcoming book, Murder in Indian Country, Death and Diplomacy on the Early American Frontier.
That one they changed to Killing Over Land. So,
Oh, so the title's different now?
Yeah, I just suck at titles, apparently. At least that's what Oklahoma says.
Welcome, Dr. Owens, please.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Joan. Thank you. Where'd Steve go? Steve. Thank you, Steve, for reaching out. This would have been fun for me anyway, but I'm currently serving as the interim department chair back in Wichita. And if you don't know what that means, basically anytime you see me on campus, I'm this close to bursting into tears. So it's just really nice to be out of town in the lovely greater St. Louis area. I should also note, in addition to thanking Steve and Joan, when it comes to PowerPoint, the polite word would be incompetent. So in this presentation, if you see anything, things looks really nice, please thank Melissa. All right, she cleaned all that up. And obviously, if you see something you don't like in the presentation, that was also Melissa. So no. Okay, I do want to get rolling on this, but actually, Larry did such a great talk earlier about George Rogers Clark. Just a quick anecdote. A number of years ago, I was at a conference, and we were talking about George Rogers Clark. And of course, this is a very sad story, right? He's this kind of big revolutionary hero, and then he ends up heavily indebted, and and later in his life he became like a pretty severe alcoholic. We always liken this would be the start of his career where Nick Nolte would play him in a movie or something. But and at one point, I can't do a casket. What are you gonna do? But at one point, this really, really sharp woman from the University of Chicago said, how much was he drinking that people in Kentucky in the early 19th century thought he was a drunk? Like, I think the answer is too much, just way too much. But okay, so maybe I should get to my talk. As Larry was mentioning, of course, obviously in the American Revolution in the West, Native Americans are a huge component. Something I think doesn't get sort of said enough is that keep in mind, the sort of standard trope is, the Indians backed the British. Well, first of all, keep in mind a huge chunk of Native Americans tried desperately to stay out of the conflict as much as they possibly could. A good example, actually, in southern Ohio, the Shawnees, about a third of them just said, forget this, and they headed west of the Mississippi to this part of the continent, what back then they were calling the Spanish Illinois. So a lot of people tried desperately to avoid it, but of course, also in the post-1783 era, while probably a majority of those who take sides do side with the British for, as Larry's talking about, sort of parallel goals that they had, a fair chunk do actually side with the Americans and actually try to help them as best they can for their own motivations and so forth. But they are, and this is a big chunk of this talk, is they're not necessarily going to be that well rewarded for their services afterwards. So Jean-Baptiste Ducoin, the Kaskaskias, and pragmatic patriotism, I always find patriot is kind of a problematic word here, but in the era of the revolution. So let's see if I do, oh, wonderful. Talking about this guy, Chief Ducoin, who's a member of the Kaskaskia Indian Nation. The Kaskaskias were part of what they called, and historians still argue about, the Illinois Confederacy, which helpfully did actually live in Illinois. That makes it easier. But these were folks initially, prior to extensive European contact, were a very, very large group, maybe 10,000 people. To put that in perspective, they were actually, in terms of population, rivals to the Iroquois League of upstate New York, in terms, again, also about 10,000 people. And you've got this sort of coalition of different groups I've got listed up there. The Cahokias, the Michigamias, the Kaskaskias, I'll be talking about, the Tamaroas, the Peorias, plus we think there were probably some more initially, and they just kind of got lost. And part of the reason that happens is that, again, one of the really sort of rough things about the fur trade in North America is a lot of natives are really sort of pressured to take sides. And this actually sort of ends up going poorly for the Illinois Confederacy. They actually were pretty early and enthusiastic converts to Catholicism. In the 1660s, Jesuit missionaries, in the 1670s, Father Marquette, the famous Father Marquette, encounters the Illinois. He did surprisingly well with the Illinois Confederacy, and the Kaskaskias in particular were really, really enthusiastic about Catholicism and sort of joined in droves. That's going to help the French quite a bit in future colonial conflicts and so forth, and also in their trade. But the problem is when you ally yourself with the French, you are, of course, putting yourself in opposition to France's enemies. And this actually goes, it's not, keep in mind all these sort of wars going back and forth. It's not just the combat. It makes it so much easier for either periodic starvation or, and also the transmission of disease. That really whittles down these populations. So the Illinois Confederacy, mid-1600s, probably about 10,000 people. By the end of the 7 Years' War, down to about 2,400. Yikes. And I've got there, not because of the Ottawas. If you ever drive through the Illinois River Valley, there's a beautiful, absolutely beautiful state park called Starved Rock Park. And a legend arises in the 19th century that, the Illinois Indians were pretty much wiped out because, and it's true, there's always a kernel of truth, right? In 1769, an Illinois Indian did, I believe he was a Peoria, did actually kill the Ottawa war chief Pontiac. Without going into it, he may have been asking for it, but he was not the most pleasant fellow. Anyway, he's killed, and then the legend is, the Ottawas chased all the Illinois Indians up on this promontory on Starved Rock, and they basically besieged them until they all died. And a number of years ago, I was on a tour with some University of Illinois students. A guy named Fred Hoxie was leading it. And he had with him, he'd invited an old friend named Helen Hornbeck Tanner. Is anybody? She edited the Atlas of Great Lakes Indian History. And just sort of was this towering figure. I remember I was staying there, and Helen, she was like 80 at the time, she's reading this sort of paragraph description of supposedly what happened at Starved Rock. She said, that may be the most factual errors I've ever seen in one paragraph. And she taught for quite a while, so I'm sure she'd seen some. Anyway, so not because of the Ottawas, but because of disease, because of warfare. Also keep in mind, too, anytime you see these stats about an Indian group dwindling, also a fair amount of that is voluntary or voluntary-ish migration. Again, a fair number of folks who had been, including the Peorias, who had been part of the Illinois Confederacy, hightail it west of the Mississippi to try and sort of avoid these kind of problems. Okay, so the Kaskaskias, getting back to the topic of the talk, the Kaskaskias were probably the largest of these groups, but again, they've really been whittled down by, again, the end of the 7 Years' War. Their population was estimated at being about 800, which is a drastic reduction. And then by 1803, no less an authority than William Henry Harrison would estimate that there were about 30 of them left. So just staggering, right? Even by post-Columbian Indian population decline, just massive. Okay, so our sort of featured character here is a man named Jean-Baptiste Ducoin, again amongst very enthusiastic French converts. Naming your son after John the Baptist, not that big a stretch, right? Very enthusiastic Catholics. And we know the nice thing about Ducoin, we actually have like the baptismal records from Fort Chart. We know he was born January 20th, 1750, and baptized a couple days later. We would also note that he was Métis. This one, not to go all graduate school on you. So that is, he's of mixed parentage. His father was a French trader and a translator, himself a former Indian captive named Ducoin. But the term Métis, if you're not familiar, of course, for a long time they used to say half-breed, which, yeah, unless you're Cher, you can't say that and get away with it. Then after a while, so like later 20th century, historians came up with mixed blood, which doesn't sound quite as bad, but it's also not great. And so we eventually adopted the French term Métis, which is, of course, is French for half-breed. But it sounds... Everything sounds better in French, you have to admit. So he was Métis. His mother, by the way, was like kind of Kaskaskia Indian royalty, essentially. And in fact, the Kaskaskias did practice, at least not for war chiefs, but for civil chiefs, it was hereditary. Now, so Ducoin has that, in his sort of pedigree, if you will. However, he is going to become the principal chief of the Kaskaskias really young. That's not a typo. He was a teenager. He was 17. And he actually becomes chief because the previous Kaskaskia chief had actually been stabbed and died in agony several months after the incident. By the way, he was stabbed by Pontiac. So again, there's a sliver of the argument there. Now, so Kaskaskias have been, they had made a lot of enemies. Of course, intertribal warfare is very traditional. It's important for a lot of these societies for men to prove their worth and gain status and so forth. So there's a lot of that. And then, obviously, colonialism makes this worse, intensifies it. One thing we'll see during the war, and I'm very proud of myself. I actually, kind of half came up with this. A lot of larger nations, again, most of the Iroquois League, but certainly not all, not the Oneidas, for example. Most larger tribes, if they take part in the war, try to side with the British because they've got the stuff, right? They've got the gunpowder and the trade goods and so forth. But a number of smaller nations, I've noticed, tended to kind of roll the dice a little bit and see, let's reshuffle the deck. I'm mixing my gambling metaphors, sorry. Let's see if we can sort of change things up a bit and side with the Americans, maybe things will come out better. So it's actually not that crazy that a group like the Kaskaskias, who are repeatedly just getting the crap knocked out of them by the Kickapoos and the Sauks and the Miamis and sometimes the Shawnees, all these larger groups are just going after them. The Kaskaskias are willing to side with the Americans. Catawbas in South Carolina, another good example. They side with South Carolina during the war. Now, of course, the Illinois country had for many decades previous to this been kind of a sketchy territory for the Kaskaskias. And Ducoin had actually led a fair number of them down into what's going to become Arkansas right towards the beginning of the war. They're not sort of big enough a tribe to play a major role in military stuff at this point, but they actually ingratiated themselves to, because Arkansas was claimed by the Spanish at this point, they ingratiated themselves to the Spanish governor because they plundered some British traders. Again, Larry was talking about parallel goals. Well, plundering British traders, well, that helps the Spanish and by degree the American war effort. But also, they wanted the stuff, so that's another reason to plunder them. However, they, by in 76, 77, they start thinking, well, we'd still rather go back to Illinois. That southern and western Illinois farmland is kind of hard to say no to. So they went back, and of course that's going to arguably pull them even further into the war. Now, again, they can't send massive war parties out, but no less a Virginian American authority than George Rogers Clark decides to try and make use of them. For example, he taps Chief DuQuoin, again, because the Americans were the Kaskaskias were very Francophilic, and they tended to be friendly towards the Americans. Clark gets DuQuoin to serve as an embassy to the Chickasaw Indians. The Chickasaws were along the Mississippi and, what we call Memphis, they used to call the Chickasaw Bluffs, so right in that area. And the Chickasaws are actually kind of a fascinating group in this era. They're of the 5, problematic term, civilized tribes. The Chickasaws were actually the smallest numerically by far, but again, if you read the accounts from the era, basically everyone's terrified of them. They were just really scrappy. They basically fought the Creeks to a standstill, and the Creeks outnumbered them like 10 to 1. And so the Chickasaws you don't want to mess with. Clark sends DuQuoin as an embassy to talk to the Chickasaws. Now, on the one hand, you might argue, if you study George Rogers Clark, this is a rare example of him using diplomacy with Indians rather than sort of setting someone's village on fire. But I think there's some pragmatism, because again, the Americans in the Western theater are pretty weak at this point, and the Chickasaws are scary. Keep in mind, by the way, up to this point in the war, I'm table setting, the Chickasaws had actually tried to stay out of it as much as they could. Virginia is going to sort of force their hand a little bit. But so DuQuoin, again, he's more than happy to sort of serve as this embassy for the Americans, although I expect there would have been some trepidation, because the Chickasaws were also one of these groups that had beaten the tar out of the Kaskaskias over previous centuries, certainly the last few decades. Now, all right. As Clark, of course, has his men out here trying to, if not conquer the Illinois country, to occupy it and so forth, the Kaskaskias were actually of great service to them by serving as hunters. Because again, Clark doesn't want to send large parties of his men out trying to hunt for subsistence, simply because that they could need to be fighting and so forth. So the Kaskaskias were able to do that, and the fact that, of course, even though they're a small group, they were Native Americans and they had tremendous facility with the woods, they could usually avoid enemy patrols when they're doing this. But again, the fact they've already been subject to attacks from other Indians, the fact that they are openly helping the Americans does not sort of aid them in that sense. And so more British-aligned groups like the Kickapoos, the Miamis, the Shawnees, and others step up their raids on the Kaskaskias, which is not helping that small population, right? They're sort of withering. Now, coming things to a head for sort of our talk and our conference here. Oh, and I should point out, some of this, by the way, I'm cribbing from, wait a minute, where'd Steve go? Steve. I'm cribbing from Steve's book about James Colbert, who was a Chickasaw chief, himself a Métis. The Chickasaws have been trying to stay out of the war, as I say, but then, and actually I need to jump ahead for a second. The Virginians decide that they're going to build a fort near the juncture of the Mississippi and the Ohio rivers. Not a bad idea in principle, right? Again, anytime rivers come together, this is why Fort Pitt was built, right? Because that's a really nice spot for control of river traffic and so forth. But the problem of putting a fort, if you're Virginia, well, it's really twofold, where the Mississippi and the Ohio come together. One, does Virginia really have the infrastructure and the resources to keep that fort supplied? Yeah, not so much. Oh, yes, Fort Jefferson. Jefferson was the governor by this point. But also, again, when you put it right there, it's shockingly close, as far as the Chickasaws are concerned, to the Chickasaw Bluffs and their home territory and their hunting territories. And so after 1780, the Chickasaws increasingly feel they can't just sort of stay out of this conflict, because this is a threat to them. and they don't take kindly to trespassers. I'll go back. So, no, I guess I did. Yeah, so they try and they build it in Chickasaw territory. Yikes. Now, again, for the Americans who are serving at Fort Jefferson, DuQuoin's Kaskaskias help them out as much as they can. They do some hunting to help feed them, because again, trying to get food to them. And there were over 100 men at one point at Fort Jefferson, and trying to keep them fed was a constant struggle. They also did some scouting, and actually I didn't realize this until reading Steve's book about Colbert. They did actually engage in some limited combat operations as well. But so the Chickasaws are infuriated by the occupation and the construction of Fort Jefferson, and they're going to start launching attacks against it. And again, the Kaskaskias are trying to help them. And again, they do engage in some limited combat operations. Actually, at one point, James Colbert was actually like under a flag of truce to sort of have a discussion with the men in the fort. And I think this says a lot about these parallel goals of, say, the Americans and the Kaskaskias. Colbert is there to try and sort of negotiate with something, and apparently the Kaskaskias just start shooting at him, which you're really not supposed to do when somebody has the white flag out. Didn't kill him, but they wounded him. But again, the Chickasaws and the Kaskaskias have been unfriendly for quite some time. But despite the best efforts of DuQuoin and his men, those repeated sort of waves of Chickasaw assaults on Fort Jefferson basically make it untenable. There's really sort of no way they're going to be able to hang on to that territory. And so in the summer of 1781, they kind of have to admit defeat, and they evacuate Fort Jefferson. Oh, Steve actually provided some lovely visuals for this. So if you could read that, this is an accounting from 1780, because again, if you study these things, a huge part of the logistics of the Army, you have to keep records. And at the very bottom, this actually is referring to an expedition into Illinois against the Sauk Indians, I believe, sort of in western Illinois. And at the very bottom, there's a line that says Indian Party. Now, this was not, like a quinceañera or something. Indian Party, they meant a war party. Couple of things to note. One, and this is the bane of all early American historians who do the frontier, they don't always specify the tribe. They just say Indian, which is not super helpful, but I believe these were actually Kaskaskias. Furthermore, if you look on the right-hand column for the total, for the cost of this expedition, actually by far the most expensive cost was that Indian party supplying these warriors. And that's something that British and American officials, and the Spanish had felt this way, the French had felt this way too. They really were lucky. Anytime a war comes and they want Indian help, even if they do diplomatically refer to them as allies, they never seem to quite connect the dots that, okay, but they're not professional soldiers, they're not your employees. And so while they would basically say, oh, they extorted from us all these gifts of gunpowder and clothing and stuff, it's like, well, they're not getting paid, kind of like American soldiers, and they expect something as compensation, right? So you did have to pay them something if you wanted them to show up. So they do actually participate in a few of those campaigns. Okay. Oh, this is a lovely, this is actually from Steve's book about Colbert, but so this is an artist's depiction of the assault on Fort Jefferson. So you see the Mississippi in the background there. So, I mean, actually it wasn't a badly constructed fort necessarily, nice blockhouse and so forth, but again, because they were so logistically, under the gun, no pun intended, wave after wave of Chickasaw assaults, even though the Chickasaws didn't actually capture the fort, strategically they achieved their objective because they made it sort of, a very unfriendly place for the Virginians. Okay. Now, Kaskaskias, I would argue their participation in the war, aside from being a small tribe siding with the United States, which again is kind of a pattern, this also for them was part of a long-term sort of strategy of seeking powerful outsiders as allies, right? They had allied, in the 17th century, when they had allied with the French, that seemed to make perfectly good sense in the Illinois country. They had a much better presence. You get French trade goods and so forth. And Du Quoin, even after Fort Jefferson sort of becomes kind of a non-issue, is going to continue actively helping, as best he can, the American war effort. For example, he actually travels all the way to Virginia in 1781, and there he works at times as what you might call a skirmisher, or also as a scout, as well as an emissary for Ohio Valley Indian tribes. He actually gets to meet Thomas Jefferson, which was certainly for Du Quoin was a big deal, and at least initially seems to be so for Jefferson as well. At this point, for example, Du Quoin, of course, Thomas Jefferson was already kind of famous, and probably from George Rogers Clark, Du Quoin had heard about this guy, Thomas Jefferson, and one of the increasingly claims to be the author of the Declaration of Independence. He's really more of the editor, but you can take my class, we'll go into that. Anyway, or you just read that wonderful Pauline Maier book. But anyway, Du Quoin had actually named his most recent son, Louis Jefferson, after Thomas Jefferson. And initially, by the way, it seems to be kind of a mutual kind of admiration society between the two men. Jefferson writes of Du Quoin that he was, quote, an Indian chief whose rank, services, disposition, and proposals are such as require attention from us and great respect. And again, I would argue there are some parallels there, Jefferson and Du Quoin, right? They both really liked France. They're both sort of highly suspicious of the British and so forth at this point. They're almost sort of custom made to be friends. Furthermore, if you think about sort of Thomas Jefferson's sort of later policies, the fact that Du Quoin and the Kaskaskias are, they're many things, they're not intimidating from an American perspective. Unlike, say, the Kickapoos or the Shawnees, they don't seem like they're going to be any hindrance to further American expansion. That also is part of the appeal, I'm sure. And I've got a partial quote from Jefferson there on the overhead. As part of his sort of speech that he's giving to Du Quoin in this delegation, Jefferson notes that we, like you, are Americans, born in the same land and having the same interests. Of course, if you're Du Quoin, you probably want to hang on to that quote and sort of throw it back in Jefferson's face a few years later. But anyway, in 1781, he actually, as I say, travels to Virginia. Oh, this is actually, you have to have a gift exchange. That's always very important. Du Quoin gave Jefferson some native painted buffalo skins, which tragically ended up, Jefferson was sort of thrilled with them, but I don't know if they didn't fully understand how to they ended up getting like moldy and nasty, and they had to throw them away. Whereas Virginia gave Du Quoin and the delegation some Virginia peace medals, and this actually Steve gave me this. This is lovely. That's like an actual example there, and of course they've got let's see, yes, rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God. That is some spin right there. That's very, very effective. But again, you see, so you've got on the obverse, you've got an Indian and a white guy smoking in a pipe. Now, Du Quoin has traveled to Virginia. He apparently at least made this is very frustrating for me because he clearly met the Marquis de Lafayette at some point. And this is right at the very beginning of the Yorktown campaign. But I can't find anything, I'm probably going to have to travel to France at some point, in Lafayette's papers mentioning this. The fantasy is at some point I'm going to be reading somebody's diaries. Oh, I met this Chief Du Quoin. He seemed like a lovely fellow. I haven't found that. You almost never find exactly what you want. But you get these sort of second and third hand references to, oh yes, he met Lafayette and so forth, and he actually carries word back west. He's still working as a courier and carrying dispatches for the Americans, and he takes word back west that to General Clark, actually. He carries the word, he's actually the one who carries the word west. Oh, by the way, Lafayette is one of these guys trapping this general named Cornwallis at Yorktown. The battle isn't actually over yet at this point, but that's how Clark first gets word that something major is afoot. So he carries these dispatches, as I say, from Fort Pitt to Clark. Now, again, you'll see this often, natives when they, even chiefs, when they encounter Americans or British or whoever, they will sort of discuss their poverty. And that's often sort of up for misinterpretation. This is actually, it's kind of a translation problem, if you will. This is Indian politeness, basically trying to say, it'd be nice if you gave me something when I talk about being poor and naked, but I'm not demanding it. And that kind of gets lost. And this is, you'll see a lot of, whites who refer to Indians as sort of being beggars, and they're missing the nuance of this. But the American officer John Gibson observed that DuQuoin, quote, he's writing to General Clark, requested that I would mention his poverty to you and desire you to give him some clothes. Keep in mind, by the way, also, as a chief, DuQuoin, it's quite possible he's not asking for clothes for himself. Most Native peoples, it's your ability to give things away to your followers. That's how you maintain your status. But that September of 1781, Clark did even better. And he actually spent $900, I put it in Virginia currency, so like $20, probably. Virginia currency was wildly inflated. But he actually spends some Virginia cash buying, quote, a rifle for John Baptist, the Indian chief. So and again, if you think about George Rogers Clark, the idea of him arming a Native American sounds weird. But again, DuQuoin was trusted, right? And they liked him as much as they're going to like somebody like that. So DuQuoin, again, so Larry talked about this a bit, but so Yorktown, of course, is the last major campaign, and this is what sort of ends up winning the war for the United States, or at least convincing the British to give up. But that war in the West between Native Americans and settlers, if I can get all graduate school on you, settler colonialism taking place, that is actually intensifying. And in many ways, that doesn't stop in 1783. A lot of that really doesn't stop until 1795, which therefore gives me the excuse to keep going chronologically on this. So DuQuoin is going to spend the 1780s, again, as an ally of the United States, advocating for them. But keep in mind, up to this point, he is still hoping to maintain his tribe's sort of land claims and so forth. And he's not looking to be melded with the United States or assimilated. For example, and he's not always going to be, he's not always going to be appreciated during this time. For example, in May of 1790, Arthur Sinclair, who was the governor of the Northwest Territory, wrote to the Secretary of War about DuQuoin, noting, quote, Baptiste DuQuoin, whom you may remember with the Marquis de Lafayette. Oh, I'd love some more details, but okay. Whom you may remember with the Marquis de Lafayette, is the chief of the Kaskaskia Nation and settled in Kaskaskia. I have been plagued with a great many of his talks. The nation is very inconsiderable, harsh, and I do not think it necessary to trouble with you with them at present, which is basically him saying we're not going to pay for DuQuoin to send a delegation to the seat of government, right? We're not going to do that. He himself is the greatest beggar I have met with among nations who are all beggars. He counts no little upon his having been with the American troops in Virginia, and so far he merits some countenance. Which again is sort of I love the 18th century. They like to have these sort of really incompatible things in the same sentence. So, or in the same paragraph. He's a beggar, but we should pay some attention to him. Now, note the broader context. It's really kind of shocking with just, even a bit of hindsight for Sinclair to sort of say something about, a chief who is clearly trying to be an ally of the United States. Because if you're familiar, in the early 1790s, the Americans could use all the help they could get in the Ohio Valley. In 1790 and 1791, they sent two punitive expeditions up into the Miami country in sort of very northeastern Indiana, northwestern Ohio. I don't have time to go into that, but basically, well, I like to put it this way. The first one was led by a general named Josiah Harmer, and it resulted in 183 dead Americans, and Harmer actually got court-martialed. That's the more successful of the two. Sinclair ends up literally the worst defeat the U.S. Army ever has at the hands of Indians. 630 killed, not to mention the civilians who were along with the Army. It makes Custer actually look like a skirmish by comparison. So Sinclair, kind of a jerk, also massively incompetent as a leader militarily. But anyway, and yet DuQuoin continues to try to help him. Continues to serve the U.S., as I said, but not always appreciated. Now, Congress did, in 1791, make a grant of land to the Kaskaskias. It was about 350 acres, more or less in the vicinity of what's now Kaskaskia, Illinois. But, I've got there in parentheses, it was their land. This is not like a gift. They just sort of, gave them title to a small chunk of their own land. Meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson has moved on up. He's no longer governor of Virginia. He's serving as Washington's Secretary of State. But he remembers DuQuoin. Hey, we've got a friend out there in the Western country. And of course, Jefferson, making sense as a Virginia plantation owner and a huge sort of land, luster. If that's proper phrasing. Jefferson has already thought of an idea. I would like somebody to go out west of the Mississippi and sort of explore in this area. And for the first leg of that, sort of crossing Illinois, he taps a guy named Andre Michaud to sort of lead this expedition. And he suggests to him, I've got this friend, Chief DuQuoin in Illinois. I'm sure he would be happy to sort of show you around and give you the lay of the land in the first leg of this tour. That expedition, by the way, ends up being aborted. They for various reasons, they cut that. But this was actually sort of the first inkling that we're going to have the Lewis and Clark expedition. Jefferson is already thinking about exploring the Western country in the 1790s. Okay. DuQuoin, again, continues. If nothing else, the Americans like having a friendly voice in the room. And as this Indian War is just going really out of control for the Ohio country, in 1792, the Americans send an American general named Rufus Putnam, who actually been like a decent general, unlike Sinclair, during the American Revolution. But he's supposed to hold a conference with Indians at Vincennes, what's going to be Vincennes, Indiana, and in 1792. However, keep in mind, just like a matter of weeks before this was supposed to take place, the Ohio Indian Confederation had actually murdered several American diplomats who'd been on their way, they apparently didn't take the right path, to negotiate with them. And so Putnam, rather than sort of going up and sort of trying to meet with them in their heartland, calls this conference at Vincennes, and it's only attended by Indians who were very friendly disposed towards the United States, including DuQuoin. About 700 actually show up, and DuQuoin, by the way, was named to be their spokesman. One said, quote, "Though he is young," now he's 42, although for a civil chief, that's actually still pretty young at this point. "Though he is young, he is the best speaker, and therefore we have chosen him to speak our sentiments." Now, keep in mind, at this point, DuQuoin, I say, he's still hoping against hope for a sort of an independent Indian homeland. He notes to the Americans, "I fear you. I am acquainted with your strength. Nobody can overset you. The Great Spirit has ordered it so. I wish to live in peace with you always." Well, good, sensible. Now, that Vincennes conference, by the way, I say it's ill-fated because, first of all, it doesn't do anything to help the United States because all the tribes who were fighting against it didn't attend. So it's kind of pointless there. Furthermore, while there was a treaty concluded, actually the U.S. Congress decided it was way too generous to the Indians. In particular, it said that they would be secure in their lands. Well, they're not going to put up with that. And so the treaty ends up accomplishing sort of almost nothing. But as late as 1793, DuQuoin will continue to advocate not only for Indian independence, but also he's hoping for a sort of a functional border. Larry was talking about some of these issues about land and security and so forth. It sounds like we're stalking the news. These are old issues. In 1793, DuQuoin goes to Philadelphia to deliver speeches to President Washington. And one of the big themes he keeps bringing up in his talks is, please do something to protect us from these Kentuckians. Because again, the blood feud between Ohio Valley Indians and Kentuckians basically doesn't end until the War of 1812, at least. DuQuoin noted the Kentuckians, quote, are like mosquitoes and try to destroy the red men. Now again, he's not talking about selling land to the U.S. or assimilating. He simply wants to be left alone. He implores Washington, keep the Americans on the other side of the Ohio and us on the other, which, sensible, but it's probably not going to happen that way. Now, the Northwest, the war against the Northwestern Confederation, it's one of these, I guess you could argue like the Revolution. It's a war that goes horribly for the United States right up until it doesn't. In the summer of 1794, they get a couple major victories, and the most important, of course, being the Battle of Fallen Timbers. This is sort of south of Toledo now in Ohio. August 20th, 1794. It's really the first time that this confederation, or really any large body of Native Americans in the Ohio Valley, has actually been defeated by the U.S. Army. And of course, the whole point was to try and sort of, nudge them into coming to a treaty conference. Now, of course, the Kaskaskias had not taken part in the battle. They certainly hadn't shot at any Americans, but they do continue to provide intelligence when they can to the Americans. Including, for example, it was actually DuQuoin is the one who tells Anthony Wayne afterwards, I've got a pretty good line on this. There were actually some Canadians helping the Indians in that battle. They provide intelligence, so forth, and then because of this, again, this is going to be, by the way, part of a kind of a pattern for how American Indian treaties are going to be negotiated. The U.S. increasingly finds it advantageous to have some friendly voices in the room rather than just the people you're seeking cessions from. So at the all-important Treaty of Greenville, this was a fort Anthony Wayne had established in Ohio. This one, by the way, really kind of sets the template for all other sort of future Indian treaties. At the Treaty of Greenville, the Kaskaskias, one of the things, the template things it sets is the U.S. government finally agrees, well, Indians do own their land and we have to pay them for it. So you get an annual payment, an annuity. And as one of the smaller tribes there, even though they're not actually ceding any land, the Kaskaskias, just for making the trip over, get a $500 annuity. Now, keep in mind for Indians, this is really a mixed bag because on the one hand, they could really use the money, or very often it was in the form of trade goods or something like that. But at the same time, the U.S. government is fully aware, you're creating kind of a culture of dependence with these handouts, if you will, and that's part of the ultimate goal. So, but the Kaskaskias, Greenville goes pretty darn well for them because they don't have to give anything up initially. I say initially, because one of the things that the treaty had mentioned, this is one of my overhits from class, actually, I love this one. So if you see about Greenville in the blue there, about 3/4 of what's going to become Ohio is ceded to the United States. Although keep in mind, Arthur Sinclair was supposed to get the entire Northwest Territory, which he couldn't do because he was running for his life. Now, so Greenville, 3/4 of Ohio, but also if you're familiar with where Vincennes is, there's this huge kind of rectangular thing that says 1795. At the treaty, it was agreed that what was called the Vincennes Tract would go to the United States, but they didn't actually survey it. Okay, well, eventually it is going to be surveyed, and it's going to be way the heck larger than most native peoples would have recognized. But throughout the 1790s, DuQuoin again continues to show his friendship for various Americans. For example, Dr. George Hunter, who is like one of these, he's a doctor, but he's also a Western explorer and so forth. In his journals from 1796 to 1805, the Western Journals of Dr. George Hunter, he describes how DuQuoin gave him both directions for crossing the Illinois Prairie, which again, before I-70 was quite an ordeal. Also, keep in mind, so much of Illinois at this point was considered a prairie desert. It was actually one of the things that made crossing it so treacherous was you didn't always know where you could get clean water. But DuQuoin actually gives Hunter some tips for how to do this, because he certainly knew. So Hunter describes DuQuoin helping him out when he was crossing the Illinois country in 1796. Jefferson has lots of French pen pals. There's a guy named Constantin Francois Volney. And Volney was talking about going to southern Indiana and southern Illinois and just sort of touring and looking around. And again, Jefferson remembers DuQuoin and says, oh, I've got a buddy out there. I'm sure he could help you. He refers to DuQuoin as his good friend and brother. That's the diplomatic usage. He further stated, and he writes this letter that Volney is supposed to take like a letter of introduction to DuQuoin. He also states in this letter, and stick a pin in this, that DuQuoin would, quote, never be disturbed in his lands. Now, I say almost helps Francois Volney. Volney, when he was en route, heard all these stories, some of which were actually true, of drunken Indians, this is a big problem in this era, getting in knife fights and so forth, and he basically sort of, he decides not to sort of take that trip. But okay, now, in terms of the Vincennes Tract I showed you on that map, the idea was a lot of native people in the region, they very much like the French when they were establishing Vincennes, and they give them what they thought was a grant of roughly 8,000 acres. However, the governor of Indiana Territory was a guy named William Henry Harrison. And Harrison and Jefferson become sort of this kind of interesting duo for masterful, shady land deals with Native Americans. If you're ever having trouble sleeping, I wrote an entire book on this. Now, basically, Jefferson and especially Harrison are going to maintain, oh, no, the Vincennes Tract, it's not 8,000 acres, it's about 1 million acres, like what I showed you on the map there. And again, in councils in 1802 and 1803, they want friendly people in the room. Oh, this is... we don't have a portrait of DuQuoin authenticated. This is from 1796. It's a salvage or Indian of the nation of Kaskaskias. It could be him. It honestly could be him. The age would be border, ballpark, and he's sort of reasonably well dressed there. He's got the lovely cloak and the pipe tomahawk and so forth. We don't. This is an Indian of the Kaskaskias. We're not sure. It could have been DuQuoin, but so that's kind of how they would have looked at this point. And there's William Henry Harrison. Note, by the way, that portrait was actually made when he was governor of Indiana, but then, of course, he becomes a general in the War of 1812, and they actually went and added the epaulets and the sword. So if you look, the way he's holding his sword looks slightly awkward. That's because it wasn't supposed to be there. But hey, Rembrandt Peale portraits are not cheap. You do what you can with them, so there's WHH. Harrison insists that DuQuoin and the pro-American chiefs represent the Indians in his June of 1803 council. Again, he gets very good at stacking the deck when it comes to these Indian councils. He wants friendly voices in the room. And so this ends up being a massive cession to the U.S., by the way. Keep in mind, there was really no additional payment other than some salt that was given to the Indians, which sounds like sort of a mean joke, right? But now, for broader context, keep in mind in 1803, when President Jefferson really goes kind of overboard looking for Indian land cessions, there is an actual reason to be scared, because the rumor, which was true, was that Napoleon and the French had retaken or were going to reoccupy the Louisiana Territory. And Jefferson, of course, who has spent the first couple of years drastically cutting the Army and the Navy to the bone, realizes, well, the best thing we can do is to get as many white settlers out there in the West as quickly and cheaply as possible. Apparently, the idea was they would form a militia which presumably would have been a speed bump as Napoleon rolled over them, because Larry was talking, colonial militia and early American militia, not great in most of these situations, and they're certainly not going to stand up to a Napoleonic army. Okay, now, later that summer, Harrison conducts a treaty with the Kaskaskias, as I note there, all 30 of them. Now wait till you see the size of the session. Again, frontier whites have been attacking the Kaskaskias. Saukes and others had sort of withered their population. And DuQuoin and the others end up selling 8 million acres of southern Illinois. 30 people, 8 acres. Do I have 10 or 5?
Less than that.
3. Okay, so let me quickly. So this is from those Charles Royce maps. Okay, the big yellow thing through the center of Illinois, that's the initial cession of the Kaskaskias. Remember, all 30 of them. And in fact, it was such a mess. Other Indians at the time protest this because they thought, the Kickapoos and others were actually using that land, and there are way more of them. This second map I'm showing you, the U.S. government in 1818 and 1819 just said, all right, we'll just buy it again. And they ended up buying the same chunk of land from multiple different groups just to sort of clean it up. All right. Let's see. Very quick, I did want to get to this part. So towards the bottom here, DuQuoin, when he died in 1811, received military rights from the local militia. They were at the funeral sous les armes, or under arms, right? So he got military rights. And this I really like. I don't know if you can read that. So if you go to the old DuQuoin Cemetery in DuQuoin in Perry County, Illinois, the local DAR actually put up, Sons and Daughters of the American Revolution, a plaque for Jean-Baptiste DuQuoin, Revolutionary War Patriot, right? And they've got his dates there, and they sort of list some of his service. Now that's kind of cool already. This is my favorite part, though. If you pull back a little bit, see there to the left, it's right next to the monument they have for modern American servicemen who've died in the service of their country. So they actually gave him a very honored spot there. That's not where he's buried, but that's where they have sort of placed him in the old DuQuoin Cemetery. So, all right, I think I'm running over. So, thank you. Were there any questions when the stuff I rambled on through there? One other thing, sorry. Despite reports to the contrary, neither the Kaskaskias nor the Peorias are actually extinct. In fact, they merged, and they have their own website. So check them out. They have a good web presence. Sorry. Questions? Anybody? Oh, yes.
Does he have any descendants today? Hold on.
I believe the question, does he have any descendants today? That's a good, see, I usually stop about 1835, so.
I'll go to Ancestry and look. He's not in the DAR database. I already checked.
Well, that's something that needs to be corrected. We should talk to the Bucco Creek chapter. They're the ones who put up the plaque, but that was only like 13 years ago they did that, so maybe the wheels of this move slowly. But the last relative of his I saw when in 1832 the Kaskaskias signed their final removal treaty from Illinois, but his granddaughter was named Ellen, and she was allowed to keep that 350 acres that they had owned. So that's unfortunately, 190 years ago. That's the most recent relative of his I had. Other questions? Oh.
Do we know the identity of his father?
Yes. His name was Rene Decougene. So we know that much. The one I should point out, by the way, because I'm guessing there may be a genealogist or two in here. There's this wonderful series of books by a woman named Martha Faribault-Beauregard, and it's called Des Forts Françaises. And it goes through like these baptismal and sepulcher or burial records for the French. And they're printed up. They're kind of hard to get a used copy. They're wonderful. However, I found out, much to my chagrin, after the article this is based on was published, there are also a lot of typos. And so it's fairly easy to get the guy's name incorrect and so forth. But yeah, so we do actually know the father's name. But don't hear much of him after this. Thought I saw another hand up. Oh. we're all glad Joan wore sensible flats today. 'Cause it's
Hi. Yeah, I saw the Osage Nation pop up on that last slide. They were based in St. Louis and had a
Yes.
Jiminy all up and down the area you're talking about.
Yes.
Did they play any role in this?
So they would periodically, they and a lot of the tribes in Illinois had sort of fought each other sort of traditionally. And that slide I had, because I spent too many time telling bad jokes. At one point in 1807, Du Quoin, this is a move of diplomacy on his part, all these other tribes are beating him up, right? And he suggests, why don't we all just form, let's get along, let's form a big group and we'll go raid the Osages, because the Osages are very bad Indians. And oddly enough, the Kickapoos and the others didn't take him up on this offer, but he's trying. He's trying to sort of do something. But yeah, the Osages in the early 19th century, you messed with at your own peril. Because first of all, physically they were huge, generally speaking, but they were gun merchants. It's basically on the plains. You've got the Lakotas run the north, the Lakotas and Cheyennes. To the south, the Comanches are basically the Gambinos of the southern plains. And then east of them, the Osages. Do not mess with the Osages. So it's, well, no, I'm teaching a course on Native Americans. I always notice in a lot of these movies, people, they talk about the Pawnees like they're the Nazi Germany of the Central Plains. Like, no, they're getting the crap beat out of them by all these different groups. It's just, they need a better press agent, I guess is what I'm saying.
All right.
it?
I guess that's it. So we will take a short
Thanks.
break, and we will come back with Colonel
Thank you.
Acosta. Thank you, Dr. Owens.